2:4. With Luther's criticisms of the Roman Church and with most of Luther's fundamental religious ideas, such as justification by faith and not by works, Calvin agreed. In what they retained of the Catholic Mass, the Communion, or Lord's Supper as they called it, Luther and Calvin developed certain doctrinal differences. Both rejected transubstantiation, but where Luther insisted that God was somehow actually present in the bread and wine used in the service, consubstantiation, Calvin and his followers tended more to regard it as a pious act of symbolic or commemorative character. There were two chief differences between Calvin and Luther. Calvin made far more of the idea of predestination. Both, drawing heavily on St. Augustine, held that human beings could never earn salvation by their own actions, that any grace that anyone, 89 predestination, 205 possessed, came from the free action of God alone. God, being almighty, knew and willed in advance all things that happened, including the way in which every life would turn out. God thus knew and willed that some were saved and some were damned. Calvin, a severe critic of human nature, felt that those who had grace were relatively few. They were the elect, the godly, the small group chosen without merit of their own for salvation. People could feel in their own minds that they were among the saved, God's chosen few, if throughout all trials and temptations they persisted in pursuing a saintly life. Thus, the idea of predestination, of God's omnipotence, instead of turning to fatalism and resignation, became a challenge to unrelenting effort, a sense of burning conviction, a conviction of being on the side of that almighty power, which must in the end be everlastingly triumphant. Calvinists in all countries were militant, uncompromising perfectionist, or Puritan, as they were called first in England and later in America. The second way in which Calvinism differed from Lutheranism was in its attitude to society and to the state. Calvinists refused to recognize the subordination of church to state, or the right of any government to lay down laws for religion. On the contrary, they insisted that true Christians, the elect or godly, should Christianize the state. They wished to remake society itself into the image of a religious community. They rejected the institution of bishops, which both the Lutheran and Anglican churches retained, and provided instead that the church should be governed by presbyteries, elected bodies made up of ministers and devout laymen. By thus bringing an element of lay or secular control into church affairs, they broke the monopoly of priestly power. On the other hand, they were the reverse of secular, for they wished to Christianize all society. Calvin, called in by earlier reformers who had driven out their bishop, was able to set up his model Christian community at Geneva in Switzerland. A body of ministers ruled the church. A consistory of ministers and elders ruled the town. The rule was strict. All loose, light, or frivolous living was suppressed. Disaffected persons were driven into exile. The form of worship was severe and favored the intellectual rather than the emotional or the aesthetic. The service was devoted largely to long sermons elucidating Christian doctrine, and all appeals to the senses, color, music, incense, were rigidly subdued. The black gown of Geneva replaced brighter clerical vestments. Images representing the saints, Mary, or Christ were taken down and destroyed. Chanting was replaced by the singing of hymns. Instrumental music was frowned upon, and many Calvinists thought even bells to be a survival of popery. In all things, Calvin undertook to regulate his church by the Bible. Nor was he more willing than Luther to countenance any doctrine more radical than his own. When a Spanish refugee, Michael Servetus, who rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and thus denied the coeval divinity of Christ, sought asylum at Geneva, Calvin pronounced him a heretic and had him burned at the stake. Calvin's Geneva 206 reformers of all nationalities flocked to Geneva to see and study a true scriptural community so that they might reproduce it in their own countries. Geneva became the Protestant Rome, the one great international center of Reformed doctrine. Everywhere Calvinists made their teachings heard, even in Spain and Italy in isolated cases, and everywhere or almost everywhere, little groups that had locally and spontaneously broken with the old church found in Calvin's institutes a reasoned statement of doctrine and a suggested method of organization. Thus, Calvinism spread very widely. In Hungary and Bohemia, large elements turned Protestant, and usually Calvinist, partly as a way of opposing the Habsburg rule. In Poland, there were many Calvinists, along with less organized 90 Talmai. The spread of Calvinism to Anabaptists and Unitarians or Socinians, as those who denied the Trinity were then called. Calvinists spread in Germany, where, opposing both Lutheran and Catholic churches as ungodly impositions of worldly power, they were disliked equally by both. In France, the Huguenots were Calvinist, as were the Protestants of the Netherlands. John Knox in the 1550s brought Calvinism to Scotland, where Presbyterianism became and remained the established religion. At the same time, Calvinism began to penetrate England, from which it was later to reach British America, giving birth to the Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches of the United States. This portrait of John Calvin conveys the determination and serious religious vision that characterized his leadership of Protestants in Geneva. Based on a painting by Hans Holbein the Younger, 1497 to 1543, this engraving by the 19th century American artist John Sartain also exemplifies Calvin's later international and transatlantic influence. Source: Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, LC USC 627202. Calvinism was far from democratic in any modern sense. It carried an almost aristocratic outlook, in that those who sensed themselves to be God's chosen few felt free to dictate to the wider population of lost souls. Yet in many ways, Calvinism entered into the development of later democratic ideas. For one thing, Calvinists never venerated the state. They always held that the sphere of the state and of public life was subject to moral judgment. For another, the Calvinist doctrine of the calling taught that a person's labor had a religious dignity, and that any form of honest work was pleasing in the sight of God. In the conduct of their own affairs, Calvinists developed a type of self government. They formed covenants with one another and devised machinery for the election of presbyteries. They refused to believe that authority was transmitted downward through bishops or through kings. They were inclined also to a more democratic or anti-monarchical outlook, because in most countries they remained an unofficial minority. Only at Geneva, in the Dutch Netherlands, in Scotland, and in New England, and for a few years in 208 England in the 17th century, were Calvinists ever able to prescribe the mode of life and religion of a whole country. In England, France, and Germany, Calvinists remained in opposition to the established authorities of church and state, and hence were disposed to 91 favor limitations upon established power. In Poland and Hungary, many Calvinists were nobles who disliked royal authority. Calvinism and democracy. The Reformation in England. England was peculiar in that its government broke with the Roman Church before adopting any Protestant principles. Henry VIII, 1509 1547, in fact, prided himself on his orthodoxy. When a few obscure persons, about 1520, began to whisper Luther's ideas in England, Henry himself wrote a Defense of the Seven Sacraments in refutation, for which a grateful pope conferred upon him the title Defender of the Faith. But the king had no male heir. Recalling the violent anarchy from which the Tudor dynasty had extricated England, and determined as a new monarch to build up a durable monarchy, he decided that he must remarry in order to have a son. He therefore requested the Pope Clement VII to annul his existing marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Popes in the past had obliged monarchs in similar situations. The Pope now, however, was embarrassed by the fact that Catherine, who objected, was the aunt of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, whom the Pope needed for support in his conflict with German Lutheranism. Henry, not a patient man, pushed matters forward. He appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, repudiated the Roman connection, secured the annulment of his earlier marriage, and married the youthful Anne Boleyn. The fact that only 3 years later he put to death the unfortunate Anne, and thereafter in quick succession married 4 more wives, threw considerable doubt on the original character of his motives. 209. Henry acted through Parliament, believing, as he said, that a king was never stronger than when united with representatives of his kingdom. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which declared the English king to be the protector and only supreme head of the church and clergy of England. All subjects were required, if asked, to take the oath of supremacy, acknowledging the religious headship of Henry and rejecting that of the Pope. For refusing this oath, Sir Thomas More, a statesman and humanist best known as the author of Utopia, was executed for treason. The Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century would pronounce More to be a saint, but Henry won English support for most of his policies. He closed all the monasteries in England, seized the extensive monastic lands, and passed them out to numerous followers. He thus strengthened and reconstituted a landed aristocracy that had been seriously weakened in the Wars of the Roses. This new landed gentry remained firm supporters of the House of Tudor and the English national church, whatever its doctrines. The Act of Supremacy 21010. It was Henry's intent not to change the doctrines at all. He simply wished to be the supreme head of an English Catholic church. On the one hand, in 1536, he forcibly suppressed a predominantly Catholic rebellion, and on the other, in 1539 through the Six Articles, required everybody to believe in transubstantiation, the celibacy of the clergy, the need of confession, and a few other aspects of Catholic faith and practice. But it proved impossible to maintain this position, for a great many people in England began to favor various ideas of continental reformers, and a small minority were willing to accept the entire Protestant position. For 3 decades after 1530, the government's religious policies veered about. Henry died in 1547 and was succeeded by his 10-year-old son, Edward VI, the child of his third wife, Jane Seymour. The Protestant party now came to the fore. But Edward died in 1553 and was succeeded by his much older half-sister, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon and a devout Roman Catholic whose whole life had been embittered by the English break with Rome. Mary tried to re-Catholicize England, but she actually made Catholicism more unpopular among the English people. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, who became King of England, though only in name. The English did not like Philip, nor the Spanish, nor the intense Spanish Catholicism that Philip represented. Under Mary, moreover, some 300 persons were burned at the stake as heretics in public mass executions. It was the first and last time that such religious executions had happened in England, and it set up a wave of horror. In any event, Mary did not live long. She was succeeded in 1558 by Henry's younger daughter, Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn. Whatever Elizabeth's real views in religion might be, she concealed them successfully and was rumored to have none. She could not be a Roman Catholic. For Catholics, she was illegitimate and so unable to be queen. 92 state religions in Europe about 1560 to 111. This map shows the legally authorized established churches about 1560, but it does not show the precise distributions of religious communities. Many Catholics lived north of the Heavy Line and many Protestants south of it. Most widely dispersed were the Calvinists and the more radical Protestants or Anabaptists. In Germany, under the Holy Roman Empire, each principality and free city chose its own religion. Hence, the Germans were the only large European population to emerge from the Reformation, almost evenly divided between Catholics and Protestants. 93 Queen Elizabeth I wanted her portraits to convey her power and royal grandeur. This painting, probably from the 1580s, uses her clothing and jewels to show her wealth and also to affirm her political stature. Print collected images. 212. Under Elizabeth, the English became Protestant, gradually and in their own way. The Church of England took on a form of its own. Organizationally, it resembled a Lutheran church. It was a state church for its existence, and doctrines were determined by the monarch acting through Parliament. All English subjects were obliged to belong to it, and laws were passed against recusants, a term used to cover both the Roman Catholics and the more advanced Calvinists who refused to acknowledge it. With the exception of monasteries and certain other church foundations, the Church of England retained the physical possessions, buildings, and internal organization of the medieval church, the bishops and the archbishops, who continued to sit in the House of Lords, the episcopal courts with their jurisdiction over marriage and wills, the tithes or church taxes paid by all landowners, the parish structure, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The Church of England. In religious practice, the Church of England was definitely Protestant. English replaced Latin as the language of the liturgy. There was no cult of the saints, and the clergy married, though Elizabeth confessed to some embarrassment at the thought of an archbishop having a wife. In doctrine, it was Elizabeth's policy to make the dogmas broad and ambiguous, so that persons of all shades of belief could be more readily accommodated. The 39 Articles, 1563, composed by a committee of bishops, defined the Protestant creed of the Anglican Church. All but one of the Anglican bishops had been newly appointed by Elizabeth at her accession. Many had lived in exile among continental Protestants in the reign of Mary Tudor, and except on the matter of church government, 94 213 through bishops, known as episcopacy. A strong Calvinist influence entered Anglican belief in the time of Elizabeth. The same ecclesiastical settlement was prescribed for Ireland, where English, or rather Anglo-Norman conquerors had settled since the 12th century, shortly after the Norman conquest of England. A replica of the Church of England was now established, called the Church of Ireland, which took over the properties and position of the Roman Church. The native Irish, however, remained almost solidly Roman Catholic. As in Hungary or Bohemia, people who resented the Habsburgs were likely to turn Protestant rather than share in the ruler's religion. So in Ireland, the fact that the ruling English were Protestant only confirmed the Irish in their attachment to the Roman Church. The Catholic priests, deprived of status, income, and church buildings, and often in hiding, became national leaders of a discontented people. The consolidation of Protestantism by 1560, neither in England, nor in Germany, nor in international Calvinism were the religious issues regarded as settled in 1560, nor had the Roman Catholic Church accepted the new situation. But by 1560, the chief Protestant doctrines had been affirmed, and geographically, Protestantism had made many conquests. The institutional unity of Latin Christendom had been broken. A world of separate churches, states, and nations was taking its place. Protestants differed in many of their religious ideas, yet certain core beliefs shaped the theology and social practices in almost every Protestant church. There was no single international organization, and even the ascendancy of Calvinist Geneva proved to be only temporary. Shared beliefs in national churches, rather than a transnational institution, sustained Protestant communities. All Protestants believed that the clergy were much like other people, which meant that the priests, whom they generally called ministers, had no special or supernatural character. Indeed, the Protestant movement was perhaps most fundamentally a revolt against the separate elevated position of the medieval clergy. There were no Protestant monks, nuns, or friars, and all Protestant clergy could marry. Protestant churches all replaced Latin with local vernacular languages, English, French, German, Czech, as the case might be. What Protestants held in common 2 and 14, all Protestants reduced their holy liturgies from 7 sacraments to 2 or 3, stressing that the retained sacraments of baptism and communion, or the Eucharist, were to be regarded more as symbols than as actual carriers of divine grace. All declared that the one true source of Christian belief was the Holy Scripture, and all believed, in one way or another, in justification by faith and in some kind of private religious conscience, while usually insisting that members of their own churches conform to specified doctrines. These widely affirmed ideas created a shared Protestant religious identity. At the same time, Protestants created new identities by clearly stating what they rejected. All rejected the papal authority. All denied transubstantiation or the miracle of the Mass, by which Catholics claimed that bread and wine actually became the body and blood of Christ. All Protestants gave up the obligatory confessional and the priestly absolution that accompanied it. They rejected the belief in purgatory as a kind of temporary zone between heaven and hell, which meant that they also gave up special prayers and services that were to help deceased persons move on to heaven. Nothing like indulgences remained, and all Protestants gave up the cult of the saints and of the Virgin Mary, whose intercession in heaven was no longer expected. What Protestants rejected, 95s, Some English Protestants wanted to move toward a more Calvinist style or purified Protestant church. This portrayal of a 16th century English family may represent this kind of emerging Puritanism because the father is teaching his children to memorize the Psalms, and the family's appearance at home suggests a firm rejection of frivolity and trifling entertainments. Print collector, Getty Images. 215. It has sometimes been maintained that one of the motivations for the spread of Protestantism was economic, that a new acquisitive, dynamic, capitalistic impulse shook off the restrictions imposed by medieval religion. The fact that Protestant England and Holland soon underwent a rapid capitalistic development gives added credibility to this idea. The alacrity with which Protestant governments confiscated church lands shows a keen material interest, but in truth, both before and after the Reformation, governments confiscated church properties without breaking with the Roman Church. Other economic changes, ranging far beyond land confiscations, also disrupted European societies throughout this era. Yet it seems that economic conditions were far less decisive than religious convictions and political circumstances. Calvinism won followers not only in cities, but also in agrarian countries such as Scotland, Poland, and Hungary. Lutheranism spread more successfully in the less economically active regions of North Germany than in the busy South. The English were for years no more inclined to Protestantism than the French, and in France, while many lords and peasants turned Protestant, Paris and many other towns remained as steadfastly Catholic. It is possible that Protestantism, by casting a moral glow of religious righteousness over a person's daily business and material prosperity, later contributed to the cultural meaning of economic success among Protestant peoples and to new cultural assumptions about the moral failings of poor people. It does not seem, however, that a Protestant work ethic or other economic factors were of distinctive importance in shaping the first stages of Protestantism. 96, 216. The new religious movements had a more immediate influence on attitudes about marriage and the family. In contrast to medieval Catholicism, which had praised sexual abstinence and celibacy as key traits of the most exalted religious persons, Protestantism strongly promoted marriage as the ideal social institution for clergy and lay people alike. Parenthood became honorable for even the most pious Protestant leaders. Although women sometimes wrote hymns or preached in the more radical Protestant churches, the model Protestant woman was the conscientious mother in a devout religious household. The opportunities for institutional leadership, even if limited, that some women had found in medieval convents and religious communities disappeared in Protestant societies, which may explain why nuns in Protestant territories were often among the last persons to accept the new religious ideas. Protestants and family life. Apart from the new emphasis on marriage, however, Protestants did little to change the role of women in Christian churches or in the wider social order. The pastors in Protestant communities were all men, and though more women may have become literate in order to read the Bible, they became less visible in Protestant rituals as the long venerated female saints vanished from prayers, religious writings, and charitable institutions. Meanwhile, women in the convents of Catholic countries were more strictly cloistered and controlled as Catholicism developed its own powerful movements for reform and reorganization.